Come with me now into a place of light and shadow, where glass walls reflect more than they reveal, and where nothing is quite as visible as it seems. Tonight's mystery unfolds within the elegant structure of Blackmere Conservatory, a jewel of iron and glass rising from manicured grounds like a cathedral devoted not to prayer, but to beauty itself. By day, the conservatory is a sanctuary of color and calm. Exotic orchids bloom beneath filtered sunlight, rare ferns curl in humid stillness, and narrow pathways wind between carefully tended worlds of green. Visitors stroll slowly, lulled by warmth and fragrance, convinced that nothing harmful could exist in such an open, luminous place. But when night falls, Blackmere changes. Moonlight fractures across the glass panes. Shadows multiply among towering palms. Condensation gathers, blurring reflections until the line between what is seen and what is imagined begins to dissolve. Footsteps echo strangely here, sound traveling farther than sight, and every movement seems doubled, distorted by mirrored surfaces. It is on such a night that death arrives, swift, precise, and impossibly clean. A respected guest collapses among the foliage, his final cry drawing witnesses from every corner of the conservatory. And yet, when help arrives, the killer is nowhere to be found. Doors have remained closed, windows sealed. Guards stand stunned. The crime has occurred in full view, and the murderer has vanished, as though swallowed by the glass itself. Into this bewildering contradiction steps Hercule Poirot. He comes not to chase shadows, but to examine them. Poirot understands that in places designed to display everything openly, deception becomes an art. Reflections mislead, paths intersect, appearances fracture, and the truth often hides not in darkness, but in plain sight. As Poirot begins to observe the witnesses, their certainty, their fear, their insistence on what they believe they saw, he senses that Blackmere Conservatory has been carefully chosen. The crime is not merely about murder. It is about illusion, about controlling perception, about vanishing without moving at all. Tonight, you are invited to walk these glass corridors with him. Look closely. Question what your eyes tell you. And remember, in a place where everything is visible, the most dangerous things are often the ones we think we cannot miss. Welcome to Blackmere Conservatory. Blackmere Conservatory was never meant for sudden movement. Its long glass corridors were designed to slow the body and quiet the mind, to encourage measured steps and softened voices. Even the air, warm, damp, heavy with the scent of soil and flowering plants, seemed to press gently against the lungs, insisting on calm. On the night of the gala, however, calm proved to be a fragile illusion. The conservatory had been closed to the public for hours, its iron gates locked, its outer grounds patrolled by discreet security. Inside, a select gathering moved leisurely among the displays, champagne glasses catching and bending the light, conversations drifting like pollen from one cluster of guests to another. At the center of it all stood Sir Alistair Pembroke. Pembroke was a man who thrived on visibility. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being watched and admired. A prominent benefactor of Blackmere, his recent donation had funded the conservatory's newest wing, a sprawling glass dome housing rare night-blooming orchids imported at great expense. Tonight, the orchids were the attraction.
Guests gathered beneath the dome as twilight deepened into night, watching pale blossoms unfurl under carefully calibrated lamps. The atmosphere was reverent, almost theatrical. Soft music played somewhere beyond the palms. Glass walls reflected faces, bodies, and movement,
multiplying the scene until it seemed as though twice as many people were present. It was in this shifting maze of reflections that Sir Alister stepped away from the group. No one noticed at first. People assumed he had wandered toward one of the displays, perhaps to admire his investment. Pembroke often did this, drifted away at precisely the moment attention settled elsewhere, only to reappear when curiosity piqued. Then came the sound, a sharp intake of breath, a brief, strangled cry. It echoed unnaturally, bouncing off glass and iron, making its source impossible to place. Heads turned. Conversations broke apart mid-sentence. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered, the sound ringing too loudly in the enclosed space. And then they saw him. Sir Alister lay sprawled near a bed of orchids, one hand clutching his chest, the other tangled in a curtain of green leaves. His face had lost all color, his eyes wide, not with confusion, but with realization. Someone screamed. Several guests rushed forward, only to stop short, uncertain where to step among the fragile plants. Others backed away instinctively, as though the air itself had become dangerous. "Don't touch anything!" shouted Mr. Harold Finch, Pembroke's financial advisor, his voice trembling despite the authority he tried to project. "Get security, now!" Guards appeared within moments, radios crackling, eyes scanning the conservatory's perimeter. Doors were checked immediately. All were secure. Windows remained sealed, their latches untouched. The dome above loomed silent and intact. Sir Alister Pembroke was dead. Within minutes, panic gave way to disbelief. "He collapsed right there," insisted Miss Violet Crane, a horticultural consultant, pointing with shaking fingers. "I saw him standing, then he wasn't." "I was only a few steps away," said Dr. Martin Hargreaves, his brow furrowed. "There was no one near him." No struggle. Security confirmed what no one wanted to believe. No one had entered or left the conservatory since the gala began. The killer, if there was one, had to be inside, and yet there was no sign of one. It was nearly an hour later when Hercule Poirot arrived. He entered quietly, escorted by the conservatory's director, his polished shoes making barely a sound on the tiled floor. Poirot paused just inside the threshold, surveying the scene with an intensity that made several guests shift uneasily. Glass. Everywhere. Glass. Poirot moved slowly toward the body, careful not to disturb the surroundings. He noted the position of Pembroke's limbs, the disturbed leaves, the faint indentation in the soil where a heel had slipped. "No blood," Poirot murmured. "Heart attack?" someone suggested hopefully. Poirot straightened and turned, his expression mild but firm. "No, madame. A heart does not behave so obligingly." He gestured toward Pembroke's hand, still clenched. Poirot crouched and examined the fingers, then the face. He inhaled gently, not touching, merely observing. "Poison," he said. The word rippled through the conservatory like a cold draft. "That's impossible," protested Finch. "He was with us the entire time." "Precisely," Poirot replied. He stood and addressed the room. "Sir Alister Pembroke was poisoned quickly, cleanly, and without struggle. The dosage was precise, the delivery subtle.
This was not chance. It was design. A murmur rose, anxious and confused. "But the killer didn't leave," said Miss Crane. "They couldn't have." Poirot's eyes flicked toward the glass walls, the mirrored surfaces reflecting the crowd back at itself. "Or perhaps," he said softly, "they did not need to." Silence fell. Poirot walked slowly around the orchid bed, stopping at several points, his gaze drawn to the reflections rather than the people themselves. Faces appeared and disappeared as he moved, layered atop one another, impossible to separate cleanly.
"This conservatory," Poirot continued, "is a place where everything is visible, and yet nothing is singular. One image becomes two, two become four. Movement multiplies." He turned back to the guests. "The murderer did not vanish," Poirot said. "You simply stopped seeing them." Fear settled in the space between the glass walls. Poirot folded his hands neatly before him. "Until we understand how this illusion was achieved," he concluded, "no one leaves Blackmere Conservatory." And somewhere among the orchids and reflections, the truth waited, perfectly hidden in plain sight. Reflections that lie. The conservatory did not sleep. Even after the guests were ushered into uneasy clusters and the music was silenced, Blackmere remained alive with sound, the soft hiss of humidity vents, the faint drip of condensation sliding down glass, the whisper of leaves brushing one another as though exchanging secrets. Hercule Poirot welcomed this. Noise, unlike silence, had patterns, and patterns, once noticed, could be broken. He began by asking everyone to remain exactly where they had been when Sir Alistair Pembroke collapsed. There was resistance at first, murmurs of discomfort, protests about the cold, the damp, but Poirot's calm authority settled the matter. Security guards repositioned people gently but firmly. Soon the conservatory resembled a frozen tableau. Guests scattered among palms and orchids, their reflections multiplying endlessly in the glass. Poirot stood at the center of the dome and turned slowly, taking it all in. "Please," he said mildly, "do not think of this as detention. Think of it as reconstruction." He approached Miss Violet Crane first. The horticultural consultant stood near a raised bed of orchids, her face pale, hands clasped tightly before her. "You say you saw Sir Alistair moments before he fell," Poirot said. "Yes," she replied quickly. "He was admiring the orchids. He leaned in, then he gasped." "And you saw no one near him?" "No one," she insisted. "I'm certain." Poirot nodded. "Certainty is admirable. Accuracy is better." He moved on. Dr. Martin Hargreaves stood several paces away, arms folded, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the glass walls. "You are a physician," Poirot said. "Tell me, how quickly would a poison of this sort act?" Hargreaves hesitated. "Seconds, perhaps a minute. It would have to be fast." "And silent?" "Yes." Poirot thanked him and continued. Mr. Harold Finch stood rigidly beside a cluster of tall ferns, his jaw clenched. "You were speaking with Sir Alistair shortly before his death," Poirot observed. Finch bristled. "About finances, nothing unusual." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet you raised your voice." Finch flushed. He was being unreasonable. Poirot made a mental note. Finally, Poirot addressed the group as a whole. "You have all said the same thing," he said, "that you saw Sir Alistair collapse, and that you saw no one strike him." He paused, then gestured broadly at the conservatory itself. "Now tell me,
How many Sir Alistair Pembrokes did you see? The question confused them. One, someone said uncertainly. Poirot smiled gently. Did you? He walked toward a section of curved glass where reflections overlapped, where iron beams divided the space into repeating arches. As he moved, his own image fractured and multiplied, Poirot upon Poirot upon Poirot. In this place, he said softly, movement does not travel in straight lines. It bounces, it repeats, it misleads. He stopped beside the orchids. Sir Alistair stepped here, Poirot said, indicating the disturbed soil. But his reflection appeared there, and there, and there. Several guests shifted uncomfortably as they followed his gesture. You were watching an illusion, Poirot continued. Not because you are foolish, but because the conservatory encourages it. Poirot then asked security to dim the lights slightly. Gasps rose as shadows deepened and reflections grew stronger. Observe, Poirot said.
He walked briskly across the floor. To the onlookers, his image seemed to move in several directions at once, approaching, retreating, overlapping itself. Now imagine, Poirot said, stopping suddenly, a man who understands this. A man who knows where to stand so that his body is hidden by reflection. A man who can move without appearing to move at all. But the poison, Miss Crane said. How could he administer it without touching Sir Alistair? Poirot turned, pleased. Ah, an excellent question. He knelt beside the orchid bed and pointed to a narrow irrigation tube running along the soil's edge. This system releases a fine mist, Poirot explained. Timed, controlled. He straightened. A contact poison, absorbed through the skin. A brief brushing of the hand against damp leaves. A man reaches out to steady himself. Realization spread across several faces. He never had to be near Sir Alistair, Poirot continued. He only had to prepare the environment. The conservatory, so open and visible, had been turned into a weapon. Poirot looked around the circle slowly. The killer did not vanish, he said again. He remained exactly where you expected him to be. Silence settled heavily now, not confusion, but dawning fear. Poirot folded his hands. In the next phase, he said calmly, we will discover who understood Blackmere Conservatory well enough to make it lie. Knowledge is a weapon. Once the illusion was named, it could no longer protect itself. Blackmere Conservatory still shimmered with reflections, but the guests no longer trusted what they saw. Eyes lingered too long on glass surfaces. People shifted their positions instinctively, testing how their bodies appeared or disappeared against iron beams and mirrored panes. Fear had sharpened perception, and with it came the first cracks in composure. Hercule Poirot welcomed this change. He gathered the guests near the central dome, where the orchids glowed softly under controlled lamps. The body of Sir Alistair Pembroke had been respectfully removed, yet his absence felt louder than his presence ever had. Every step taken near the orchids now carried weight. We have established, Poirot began calmly, that the method required knowledge, not strength, not speed. Knowledge. He let the words settle. Therefore, we must ask a simple question. Who among you understood Blackmere Conservatory not as a visitor, but as a system? He turned first to Miss Violet Crane. You are responsible for the care of these plants, Poirot said. Tell me, how long have you worked here? 7 years, she replied quickly. I know every bed, every cycle. Every irrigation schedule? Poirot asked. Yes, she said, then hesitated. But I don't control them. Who does? Poirot asked gently. She swallowed. Dr. Hargreaves and I, for experimental humidity control. Poirot nodded and moved on. Dr. Martin Hargreaves stood rigid, his medical composure strained. You specialize in toxicology, Poirot said. That is correct? Yes, Hargreaves replied sharply. But I do not experiment on people. No, Poirot agreed. You experiment on reactions. Poirot gestured toward the orchids. Certain poisons, he continued, are absorbed through the skin when combined with moisture. You would know this. Hargreaves clenched his jaw. Many doctors would. But few, Poirot replied, would think to combine medicine with botany. The doctor said nothing. Poirot turned next to Harold Finch, whose irritation had hardened into something closer to fear. You managed Sir Alistair's finances, Poirot said. You knew his movements, his habits? Yes, Finch snapped. But I know nothing of plants. Poirot smiled faintly. You know pressure. And Sir Alistair was under great pressure. Finch's voice dropped. He was reckless. Poirot leaned closer. Reckless enough to threaten exposure? Finch stiffened, but did not deny it. Poirot stepped back and addressed them all. Sir Alistair Pembroke intended to announce something tonight. A restructuring, a withdrawal of funds, a redirection. Murmurs rippled through the group. He had discovered irregularities, Poirot continued. Mismanagement, quiet profiteering. Finch's face flushed. Poirot raised a hand. But knowledge of motive alone does not make a murderer. He turned again, this time toward the glass. Knowledge of space does. Poirot walked slowly along the curved wall, stopping where iron supports intersected at precise angles. Here, he said, positioning himself carefully. My body disappears. Gasps followed as his reflection fractured, his form partially swallowed by overlapping pains. This, Poirot said calmly, is where the killer stood. He stepped aside. And this, he added, pointing toward the orchids, is where Sir Alistair brushed the leaves. Poirot looked back at Miss Crane. You adjusted the irrigation schedule today, he said quietly. She shook her head violently. For the orchids, nothing more. And you informed Dr. Hargreaves, Poirot continued, that the system would mist at precisely 9:15. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know, she whispered. Poirot turned to Hargreaves. You did, Poirot said. The doctor exhaled sharply. It was meant to frighten him. The dosage was calculated to induce panic, not death. Poirot's voice hardened. Poison is not a negotiation. Silence fell again, heavier now. Poirot folded his hands neatly. Someone prepared the environment, he said. Someone ensured the poison would be delivered invisibly. Someone trusted illusion more than truth. He paused, letting his gaze rest on each face in turn.
and someone here believed they could vanish without moving. But Poirot knew better. The conservatory had revealed its secret. Now it would reveal its killer. Once the possibility of illusion was exposed, Blackmere Conservatory no longer felt like a place of beauty. It felt like a diagram.
Hercule Poirot walked its curved path slowly, not as a detective now, but as a mathematician tracing invisible lines. Glass, iron, light, moisture, everything here obeyed rules. And rules, Poirot believed, were far more reliable than people. The guests had been confined to the eastern wing while Poirot conducted his examination. From time to time their voices drifted faintly through the foliage, nervous, hushed, uncertain. No one raised their voice now. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves in a building that made people disappear. Poirot stopped beneath the central dome and looked upward. The glass panels curved inward at a precise angle, meeting iron ribs that radiated outward like spokes of a wheel. At night, these ribs cast shadows that overlapped perfectly with reflections, creating narrow pockets where depth perception collapsed entirely. "Excellent craftsmanship," Poirot murmured. "Dangerous if misunderstood." He retraced Sir Alistair Pembroke's final movements, following the marks left in the soil. The victim had not wandered randomly. He had been guided, not by force but by suggestion. A gesture, a word, a look toward the orchids at precisely the right moment. Poirot recalled Finch's raised voice, Miss Crane's insistence, Dr. Hargreaves' silence. Too many pressures converging at once. Poirot summoned the guests again, positioning them deliberately this time. "Please," he said politely, "stand exactly where you were when Sir Alistair collapsed." They complied, visibly uneasy. Poirot adjusted them slightly, one step left, another backward, until the pattern emerged. From their positions, every sight line converged away from the true point of contact. "You were all watching," Poirot said calmly, but none of you were seeing." He stepped into the narrow pocket of visual collapse near the orchids. From most angles, his body appeared broken, incomplete, more reflection than form. "This," Poirot said, "is where the killer acted." Dr. Hargreaves stiffened. Poirot continued. "The poison was transferred through moisture on the leaves, a skin-absorbed compound, colorless, odorless, fast-acting. But such substances are unstable." He turned sharply toward the doctor. "They must be prepared shortly before use." Hargreaves swallowed. "You cannot prove—" Poirot raised a hand. "I am not finished." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded handkerchief. Inside lay a thin glass vial. "This was found," Poirot said, "in the waste receptacle of the medical preparation room." A murmur spread. "The residue matches the compound used," Poirot continued. "You prepared it, Doctor. You timed it. But you did not choose the moment." Poirot turned now, slowly, toward Harold Finch. "You chose the moment," Poirot said. Finch recoiled. "That's absurd." "You argued with Sir Alistair moments before his death," Poirot continued. "You knew exactly when he would step away. You ensured the environment was ready." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But you did not understand the geometry." Silence fell. "You believed," Poirot said, "that knowledge of finance was enough. That illusion would protect you." Poirot gestured around them. "But illusion is a system, and systems betray those who misunderstand them." Finch's composure shattered.
He was going to ruin me, Finch hissed. Everything I built. Poirot's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. And so you used knowledge borrowed from others. Knowledge you did not respect. Guards stepped forward. Dr. Hargreaves lowered his head. Miss Crane wept openly. Poirot straightened his jacket. The killer did not vanish, he said quietly. He hid inside the rules of this place. And now, with the geometry exposed, there was nowhere left to hide. Once exposed, guilt behaves very differently from fear. Fear scatters. It looks for exits, reflections, excuses. Guilt, however, settles inward. It grows heavy. It pulls the shoulders down, slows the breath,
and fixes the eyes on the floor, as though the truth might be written there. Hercule Poirot observed this transformation with quiet certainty as the reality of the crime settled over the remaining guests inside Blackmere Conservatory. Harold Finch no longer argued. The man who moments earlier had shouted and gestured now sat heavily on a wrought-iron bench near the orchids, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles blanched. The conservatory lights reflected off the glass walls, as they always had. But now those reflections no longer protected him. They only multiplied his disgrace. Dr. Martin Hargreaves stood apart, pale and hollow-eyed. Miss Violet Crane had retreated toward the edge of the dome, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Security guards remained respectfully still, allowing Poirot to proceed. Poirot approached Finch slowly. "You see, monsieur," Poirot said gently, "confession is not a single moment. It is a sequence, and you are already in it." Finch let out a humorless laugh. "You think this was my idea? The poison? The plants? I barely understand how half of this place works." Poirot nodded. "Just so. That is why you needed help." Finch looked up sharply. "You needed someone who understood chemistry," Poirot continued. "Someone who understood botany. And someone who understood timing." Poirot turned briefly toward Hargreaves and Crane. "You did not plan a murder," Poirot said to them. "You planned control, fear, manipulation." Miss Crane shook her head violently. "I never touched the poison." "And I believe you," Poirot replied. "But knowledge shared without restraint becomes a weapon." Hargreaves closed his eyes. "I told myself the dosage was safe, that it would only cause panic." Poirot's voice hardened slightly. "Poison does not respect intention." Poirot returned his attention to Finch. "You were desperate," Poirot said calmly. "Sir Alistair Pembroke had discovered irregularities, misdirected funds, silent commissions, arrangements that benefited you quietly for years." Finch's lips trembled. He was going to announce it, tonight, in front of everyone. "Yes," Poirot said, "and panic makes men reckless." Finch slumped forward. "I didn't touch him, I swear it." Poirot nodded again. "No, you did something far worse. You turned a place of beauty into a delivery system." He gestured toward the orchids. "You ensured Sir Alistair would step here. You raised your voice. You redirected attention. You trusted that the environment, prepared by others, would finish the work." Finch buried his face in his hands. I thought he would stagger, collapse, create confusion. I would buy time."
Poirot said nothing. When Finch finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "I didn't think he'd die." Poirot's voice softened, not with forgiveness but with finality. "No one who uses poison ever does." The conservatory fell silent again, but this time the silence carried clarity rather than confusion. Poirot turned to the others. "Dr. Hargreaves," he said, "your expertise made this possible. Miss Crane, your devotion made it accessible. But neither of you chose the moment." He faced Finch once more. "You did." Security stepped forward now, gently but firmly. As Finch was led away, Poirot remained still, his gaze lingering on the orchids. Their pale blossoms glowed beneath the lights, innocent and unchanged. "Nature," Poirot murmured to himself, "is never guilty. Only people are." The guards returned moments later to escort Hargreaves as well. The doctor did not resist. His shoulders sagged with the weight of realization, perhaps heavier than the handcuffs that followed. Miss Crane remained behind, trembling. Poirot approached her last. "You must understand," he said gently. "Knowledge requires responsibility, even when offered in good faith." She nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I wanted to protect the conservatory." Poirot sighed softly.
Protection that abandons conscience becomes destruction. As the night deepened, Blackmere Conservatory began to feel like itself again. Not safe, not yet, but honest. The illusion had collapsed. The geometry no longer deceived. Poirot straightened his coat and glanced once more at the glass walls. The killer had not vanished. He had simply been revealed. Consequences in plain sight. With the removal of Harold Finch and Dr. Martin Hargreaves, Blackmere Conservatory seemed to exhale for the first time since Sir Alistair Pembroke's death. The lights remained bright. The glass walls still reflected every movement, yet the tension that once clung to the air like mist began to thin. What remained was heavier in a different way, the weight of consequence. Hercule Poirot understood this phase well. Discovery satisfied the intellect, but consequence tested the soul. He requested that the remaining guests gather once more beneath the central dome. They complied without protest now. Miss Violet Crane stood apart from the others, her face drawn, eyes red-rimmed. Several benefactors whispered quietly among themselves, no longer concerned with reputation but with distance, how quickly they might leave, how far this scandal might reach. Poirot addressed them calmly. "The crime at Blackmere Conservatory was not born in a single moment," he said. "It grew slowly, fed by ambition, silence, and the belief that cleverness excuses responsibility." No one interrupted. Sir Alistair Pembroke believed visibility protected him, Poirot continued. He believed that because this place was open, because it was filled with light, no harm could be done unseen. Poirot gestured toward the glass walls. He was wrong, and yet he was not entirely mistaken. Poirot invited Miss Crane to step forward. She hesitated, then obeyed. "You cared deeply for this place," Poirot said gently. "Tell them why." Her voice shook. "Because Blackmere is alive. Because it teaches patience, growth, balance." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you allowed it to be weaponized." She nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I thought knowledge was neutral. I thought if I didn't act, I wasn't responsible." Poirot met her gaze. "Neutrality," he said, "is a decision."
The words struck harder than accusation. Poirot then turned to the benefactors. "Many of you benefited from Sir Alistair's management," he said, "and many of you suspected irregularities, yet none of you spoke." A murmur rippled through the group. "Silence," Poirot continued, "is the most cooperative accomplice." Outside, dawn began to lighten the sky, turning the glass panes pale blue. The reflections softened, shadows shortened. The conservatory no longer distorted perception, it clarified it. Constables arrived quietly, taking statements, documenting evidence, photographing the scene. The process was methodical, almost reverent. Poirot watched without interference. Justice, once engaged, required no supervision. Later, Poirot found Miss Crane alone among the orchids. She knelt beside a bed, gently adjusting a leaf that had been crushed during the chaos of the night. "They will close the conservatory," she said quietly. "For a time," Poirot replied. "Not forever." She looked up. "Do you believe that?" Poirot nodded. "Places built on truth recover. Those built on illusion collapse." She considered this, then returned to her work. As Poirot prepared to depart the dome, he paused and looked once more at the glass corridors. The illusion that had once hidden a killer now revealed only structure: iron ribs, transparent panes, simple geometry. Nothing magical, nothing deceptive. Only people had lied. Poirot adjusted his mustache and turned toward the exit. The conservatory would endure, but it would never again pretend that light alone was enough. The price of transparency. The morning after the arrests dawned clear and brittle.
Sunlight sliding across the glass ribs of Blackmere Conservatory with an honesty that felt almost intrusive. Where once reflections had deceived, they now exposed. Every iron joint, every condensation line, every smudge left by hurried hands stood plainly visible. Transparency, Poirot reflected, was not a comfort, it was a reckoning. He arrived early, before the remaining guests gathered, before the conservatory resumed its cautious routines. The orchids were already stirring beneath the lamps, petals opening with patient inevitability. Nature, unlike people, did not rush its confessions. Poirot walked the length of the central dome, retracing the geometry that had made the crime possible. He paused where Sir Alistair Pembroke had stood, then shifted a single step to the left. The illusion collapsed. From this angle, the sightlines aligned cleanly. There was nowhere to hide. The difference, Poirot knew, was not architectural. It was moral. By mid-morning, the remaining benefactors assembled at Poirot's request. Their confidence had thinned to a brittle politeness. Eyes met and slid away again. The conservatory director hovered near the periphery, clasping a folder of documents as if it were a shield. Poirot addressed them without preamble. "You have seen," he said calmly, "what cleverness can accomplish when conscience is absent. Today, you will decide what honesty can repair." A murmur rippled, uneasy, resistant. "The investigation will continue," Poirot went on. "Financial audits, governance reviews, public statements." He raised a finger. "But these processes mean nothing if they are treated as performances." One of the benefactors, an older man with a practiced smile, cleared his throat. We have reputations to consider. Poirot's gaze fixed on him. So did Sir Alistair. Silence followed, sharp and clarifying. Poirot then produced a slim dossier and laid it on a nearby bench. These are the provisional findings. They will be shared. Not selectively, not quietly. Fully. The director stiffened. That could jeopardize funding. It could restore it, Poirot replied. Truth has a way of attracting those who value it. Miss Violet Crane stood at the edge of the group, hands clasped, shoulders squared as if bracing against a storm. Poirot beckoned her forward. You will assist the auditors, he said gently. Your knowledge is essential. She nodded. I will. Poirot turned back to the benefactors. And you will remain. Answer questions, correct records, accept scrutiny. A woman near the back spoke up, voice thin. What if this destroys Blackmere? Poirot did not hesitate. Then Blackmere would have been built on something that deserved to fall. The words landed heavily, but they did not break the room. Instead, something steadier took hold. Responsibility, Poirot saw, was contagious when modeled without fear. Later, Poirot found himself alone with the conservatory director beneath the dome. The man's hands trembled slightly as he straightened papers. I never imagined, the director said, that openness could be exploited. Poirot smiled faintly. Openness without ethics is merely access. They stood together, watching the light settle. By afternoon, constables returned with updates. Statements were taken, schedules were reconstructed. The irrigation system, once a tool of deception, was catalogued and secured. Each step felt like a stitch drawn tight, closing a wound. Poirot walked the perimeter one last time. Where illusions had once multiplied, clarity now prevailed. He noticed how visitors, few as they were, moved differently, slower, more deliberate, as if seeing the space anew. As he prepared to depart, Miss Crane approached. I will testify, she said quietly, about the system, about what I knew. Poirot inclined his head. That is the price of transparency. She swallowed. And the reward? Poirot looked out across the orchids, luminous and patient.
The chance to begin again without mirrors. When Poirot finally stepped outside, the glass behind him reflected only sky and trees. The conservatory stood revealed, still beautiful, still complex, but no longer deceptive. Order, Poirot thought, was not restored by concealment. It was restored by courage. When the first visitors were allowed back into Blackmere Conservatory, they came cautiously. It was late afternoon, the light softened by high clouds, and the iron gates opened not with ceremony, but with care. A handful of patrons, garden members, local trustees, a journalist or two, moved along the pathways with measured steps, voices lowered as if the plants themselves might be listening. The conservatory looked unchanged, yet everything about it felt different. The glass still caught the light, the palms still arched overhead, but the air no longer carried the comfortable assumption that beauty guaranteed safety. Hercule Poirot watched from a discreet distance. He had insisted on being present for this reopening, not as an authority, but as an observer. People revealed themselves most clearly not during confrontation, but during recovery. How they explained, how they avoided, how they remembered. Miss Violet Crane stood near the orchid beds, answering questions with deliberate precision.
She spoke of irrigation schedules and humidity controls, of safeguards newly installed, of redundancies designed to prevent misuse. She did not dramatize. She did not minimize. Poirot approved. Honesty, he knew, required neither apology nor performance, only clarity. A journalist approached Poirot, notebook in hand. "Monsieur Poirot, do you believe Blackmere can regain public trust?" Poirot considered the question carefully. "Trust," he said, "is not regained. It is rebuilt, piece by consistent behavior." The journalist nodded, scribbling, then hesitated. "And the killer?" Poirot's eyes drifted toward the glass dome.
The killer believed invisibility was power. He learned otherwise. By evening, the conservatory had settled into a quieter rhythm. The remaining guests departed, security routines adjusted, documentation prepared for auditors and courts alike. The mechanisms of accountability, slow, imperfect, but necessary, began their steady work. Poirot took a solitary walk through the central dome as dusk approached. Without the crowds, the geometry revealed itself plainly. The iron ribs traced honest lines. The panes reflected without distortion. The very features that had once enabled deception now felt instructive, as though the building itself had learned something about restraint. He paused near the orchids. Sir Alistair Pembroke had believed exposure would correct the system. He had been right, though not in the way he expected. Poirot allowed himself a moment of quiet regret. The truth had arrived, but it had demanded a price. Justice often did. A soft footstep sounded behind him. Miss Crane approached, holding a folder. "These are the updated protocols," she said. "They incorporate the audit recommendations." Poirot accepted the folder, leafed through it, and returned it. "You have done good work." She exhaled. "It feels insufficient." Poirot smiled gently. "It is sufficient to begin." As night fell, the conservatory lights warmed to a gentle glow. Reflections softened rather than multiplied. From outside, Blackmere appeared as it always had, a luminous structure set against the dark grounds. But inside, something essential had shifted. The place no longer promised perfection. It promised vigilance. Poirot prepared to leave. At the threshold, he turned for a final look. The glass had cleared. What remained was choice. And for the first time since the gala, Blackmere Conservatory seemed ready to choose wisely. By the time the authorities completed their final inspections, Blackmere Conservatory had become something rarer than it had ever been before. It had become honest. The spectacle was gone, the murmured excitement, the unspoken assumption that beauty excused complexity. In its place stood a quieter institution, still elegant, still remarkable, but stripped of its theatrical innocence. Hercule Poirot recognized the transformation immediately. Order had returned. But it was a different kind than before, no longer decorative, no longer assumed. It was deliberate. Poirot arrived for his final day shortly after sunrise. The grounds were calm, dew clinging to trimmed hedges, the glass dome reflecting a pale sky unbroken by cloud. Workers moved discreetly inside the conservatory, recalibrating systems, documenting changes, sealing access points that had once been taken for granted. Every action was logged, every routine examined. Accountability, Poirot observed, was tedious by design. Inside, the central dome felt larger than before, not because it had changed, but because nothing inside it pretended to be hidden anymore. The orchids bloomed quietly, indifferent to scandal or scrutiny.
Nature, as always, remained unconcerned with human failure. Poirot met briefly with the lead inspector, who confirmed that Harold Finch had formally confessed, detailing not only the murder, but the financial deceptions that had preceded it. Dr. Hargreaves, too, had admitted his role in preparing the compound, his justification unraveling under methodical questioning. Miss Violet Crane's testimony, though painful, had been precise and invaluable. "She understood the system," the inspector said, "and now she's helping dismantle its misuse." Poirot nodded. "Understanding is neutral. Responsibility is not." Later that morning, Poirot encountered several former benefactors preparing to depart. Their demeanor had changed markedly. Conversations were subdued, no longer concerned with prestige, but with consequence. One man approached Poirot hesitantly. "Do you think this could have been prevented?" Poirot considered him carefully.
"Yes," he said simply. "Many times." The man swallowed. "Then why wasn't it?" Poirot's reply was gentle but firm. "Because no one wished to be the first to disturb the illusion." The words lingered. Poirot walked the conservatory one final time, alone. He traced the paths where reflections had once multiplied guiltlessly, where a man had believed he could vanish by standing still. Without the crowd, without the performance, the place felt instructive rather than deceptive. He stopped at the precise point where Sir Alistair Pembroke had fallen. The soil had been replaced, the plants tended, no visible mark remained. Yet Poirot knew the imprint persisted, not in the ground, but in the institution's memory. That, he hoped, would be enough. As he turned toward the exit, Poirot caught his reflection in the glass, single, undistorted, unmistakable. He adjusted his mustache thoughtfully. Illusion had been defeated not by force, but by understanding. And understanding, once gained, was very difficult to lose. Outside, a motor car waited. Poirot paused, looking back once more at Blackmere Conservatory. It stood luminous in the morning light, transparent without being naive, beautiful without pretending safety. Order had returned, not the comfortable order of assumption, but the resilient order of truth. Blackmere Conservatory greeted its last morning with a gentleness that felt earned. Sunlight filtered through the vast panes without distortion, laying clean lines across the tiled paths and the orderly beds of orchids. The air was warm, but not oppressive, humid, yet balanced. Systems hummed quietly in the background, regulated, logged, accountable. For Hercule Poirot, the sound was reassuring. Order, when honest, did not demand attention. It simply worked. Poirot arrived early, as was his habit at the end of a case. He preferred to witness places at rest after the drama had drained away. The conservatory was nearly empty. A groundskeeper tended a row of ferns with deliberate care. A security officer made a slow circuit, footsteps unhurried, eyes observant rather than anxious. The crisis had passed. The consequences remained. Poirot paused beneath the central dome, standing where the geometry once betrayed the eye. Now the angles were plain, the intersections honest. Without crowds and clever timing, the space revealed itself for what it was, a structure designed to showcase life, not hide death. He reflected on Sir Alistair Pembroke. Pembroke had believed that exposure would correct wrongdoing. In that, he had been right. Where he misjudged was the cost. Truth did not arrive gently when it had been delayed for too long. It came with force, not of violence, but of consequence.
And consequence, Poirot knew, had a way of redistributing pain. Miss Violet Crane approached quietly, holding a clipboard. She stopped at a respectful distance. "They've approved the phased reopening," she said, "with oversight." Poirot nodded. "Oversight is the language of humility." She hesitated. "I keep thinking, if I had asked one more question, if I had insisted on safeguards sooner." Poirot met her gaze. "Regret," he said softly, "is proof that conscience survived." She exhaled, steadying herself. "I won't make the same mistake again." Poirot smiled faintly. "That is all justice ever asks." A short while later, Poirot met with the conservatory director for a final exchange of documents. Audits were scheduled. Governance had been restructured. Transparency was no longer a slogan. It was procedure. The director thanked Poirot with restrained gratitude, the kind that carried understanding rather than relief. "Will Blackmere recover its reputation?" the director asked. Poirot considered the question. "Reputation," he replied, "recovers when behavior changes and remains changed." As midday approached, Poirot prepared to depart. He took one last walk along the perimeter, letting his eyes follow the lines of iron and glass. Without illusion, the building felt sturdier, less theatrical, more trustworthy. At the exit he paused and glanced back. The conservatory did not glow as brightly as it once had in photographs. It did not promise wonder without vigilance. Instead, it offered something rarer, clarity. And clarity, Poirot believed, was the true measure of safety. He stepped into the waiting motor car. As the vehicle moved away, Blackmere Conservatory receded into the distance, glass catching the sun, iron holding firm. The place remained beautiful, but now it was honest. Order had returned, not because the glass reflected less, but because the people behind it had learned to see. Reflections at Rest. And so, dear listener, our journey through Blackmere Conservatory comes quietly to its end. The glass corridors stand calm once more. The orchids bloom without witness. Reflections linger, but no longer deceive. What was once a place of illusion has become a place of understanding, where beauty is paired with responsibility and openness is guided by care. This was not merely a mystery of how a killer vanished, but of why we so often trust what we see without question. In a world designed to display everything, Hercule Poirot reminded us that truth is not always hidden in darkness. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, protected by certainty, by routine, by the comfort of believing nothing could go wrong. Sir Alistair Pembroke believed exposure would correct imbalance. He was right, but at a cost he never imagined. And in the aftermath, Blackmere learned that transparency without conscience is fragile, while accountability, though uncomfortable, endures. If this story held you in its quiet tension, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which detail changed your suspicions? At what moment did the illusion finally break for you? Share your reflections and theories in the comments. And if you enjoyed this slow burn mystery, consider liking,
subscribing, and joining us again. There are many places built of glass and certainty, each with secrets waiting to be seen clearly. Until our next case, rest well, watch closely, And remember, order returns not when illusions vanish, but when understanding remains.